It's an attempt to explain the problem that Britain's heather moors are faced with, which is simply that the traditional way of managing them and the people who have traditionally had the power to manage them is about to change unless we're very careful.
It's an angry book.
No, it's a firm book.
It lays out a vision of moorlands, and it lays out a vision of what moorlands could become, and so it's a threatening book.
The trick with the thing that everybody should remember when they're talking about heather moorland and what happens if you stop grouse shooting and grouse moor management is that you don't have to speculate. It is all visible in plain sight. It has happened all over the country. If you go to Wales, you can find Lake Vyrnwy, which ceased to be a grouse moor 40 years ago, been managed by the RSPB for 40 years. When they took it over, if you take one species, the curlew, they said in a publication of their own that there were large numbers of breeding curlew on the moor. Last year they applied for a £3.3 million grant from the Heritage Lottery Fund, and the reason that they needed it included the fact there weren't any curlew. Now that's not my fault, it's not grouse moor keepers' fault, it is the fault of the people that manage that land. It's as simple as that.
And there are many other examples like that.
There are so many examples. I mean, it is very difficult to believe that the people who are attacking grouse moor management aren't doing it in the full and certain knowledge that what they are going to bring about is a catastrophe. You don't have to, I have to keep saying, if you look at the Berwyn Hills in Wales, GWCT did a simple exercise. They got all the BTO data for all the upland birds in the Berwyns, and then they drew a line when grouse moor management ended. And all those birds, golden plover, lapwing, black grouse, curlew, red grouse, their numbers fell off a cliff. Now, that was a coincidence, was it? No, of course it wasn't. And if you go, you don't have to. I went to two moors 2 years ago. I went to Denby Moor and Denby Moor. The Denby Moor is spelt differently in Wales, that's all. Denby Moor in the North York Moors, we had a day's grouse shooting. I saw golden plover, I saw lots of different birds, and we saw lots of grouse. And it was a beautiful mosaic landscape, plenty of wildlife, plenty of interesting biodiversity. I went to the Denby Moors the same week. It was a sea of long, dark heather. I saw 6 grouse and 4 snipe in the entire. I didn't shoot the grouse. It seemed a bit unfair after, So we didn't shoot anything, but it was birdless. The only patch where there was anything, where some picnicker had set fire to the heather a few years before, and you've got a big strath of wildfire. So there's a bit of life along the edge of the burn, but otherwise it was dead. And they know it. I mean, that's a tragedy.
Right, I found myself in a slightly difficult position of trying to defend the RSPB, but I shall. Please can you switch off all recording devices. You're talking about Wales, which is more marginal for grouse than Yorkshire, surely?
Oh yeah. No, well, curious enough, it wasn't. Heather grows faster in Wales than anywhere else. The Peak District is pretty quick, but heather grows quicker in Wales. So the capacity for Wales to produce grouse is enormous. The biggest bag of grouse shot in Wales in recent times was on Rwabon Moor. Not in my lifetime, but very nearly. The decline of grouse shooting in Wales is quite a recent phenomenon, largely brought about by forestry. It's very difficult now to keep grouse in Wales because the hills are so cut up by forest. And that means that you've got a lot more predators, generalist predators like foxes and crows. But it is perfectly possible to produce grouse in Wales. And Rwabon Moor, which is currently being managed as a grouse moor, it's not the only grouse moor in Wales, but 1 or 2 people are trying to bring them back. The peak count of lecking blackcock on Rwabon Moor, which had 2 gamekeepers on it, killing foxes, stoats and crows, was just over 300 lecking blackcock. which makes it one of the biggest concentrations of blackcock in Western Europe. The best count on Vernary that I can find is 8, and last year it was 1, or possibly 1. Now I don't know, my maths isn't that good, but there's a substantial difference between 8 and 350. And yet, the people that have resulted in the 8, the people whose plans have resulted in there being no curlew on 3,500 acres of moorland, are getting money from the Welsh Government to explain to people who own land in the Welsh uplands how to manage it. Well, I mean, I couldn't sleep if I was doing that. I'd expect somebody to go knock on the door. The police do me for fraud. I mean, it's outrageous.
So why are the RSPB doing this? Is it simply about money? I know they've got a £65 million hole in their pension plan they need to fill, but why are they doing this, do you think?
The RSPB do a lot of good things, and they have a lot of good people who work for them, and they have a lot of people who, I'm a member, they have a lot of people who are members, who are members for the right reasons. The problem, I think, is that they've grown. When I was first a member, their annual budget was just under £1 million. Last year it was £160 million. No, sorry, £146 million. I think the problem with any large organisation is the risk of hubris. As you get bigger, you think you get better. Well, you don't, you get bigger. It's a different thing. And what they should be asking themselves every morning when they get up is, are we 146 times better than we were when we turned over £1 million? Because if you aren't, you ought to be ashamed of yourself.
Well, the reason I just brought that, and I just had a little bit of laughter when I pointed out the £65 million hole in their pension plan, but there is a question of ideology here as well. I mean, there are some people in the RSPB now who you wouldn't have recognised when you first joined the organisation, because they are ideologues. They have a belief set about what the British countryside should look like, and they want a way to apply that to it.
I think one of the fundamental themes that runs through this book is to try and debunk an extraordinary idea that if you give the conservation industry enough money, and if you give the regulator enough power, then you can make things go right. Well, you can't, because you're ignoring the people who actually run the countryside. You're ignoring the people who own it and work on it and understand it. And there is no doubt at all in my mind, well, there isn't any doubt in anybody's mind, even the people that are perpetrating it, that there is a conscious effort by a large section of the conservation industry, including large parts of the senior management of RSPB and of the regulators, that farmers, gamekeepers, landowners are just a bloody inconvenience. And if they'd get out of the way and just do what they were told, we could straighten all this out. Well, you can't. And the bizarre thing is that I worked all my life in a city, and I had to work with communities in a city, and I had to enforce the law in a city. And if you tried to do that in Birmingham or Manchester, you wouldn't survive. You'd be sacked. The idea that you walk into a part of Birmingham and tell the local community, this is what you're going to do, not this is what you're going to put up with, this is what you're going to do. Because they're not asking you, it's worse than, don't just stop things, do things. The local people would be outraged, and rightly so, and so would all the regulators, and so would the councillors, and so would the MP. It is normal in rural England for somebody to turn up with a clipboard and tell you what to do. Can you imagine what it's like to own and manage a grouse moor? You've got it into a state which is generally regarded as beautiful. It's in an area of outstanding natural beauty. It's in a national park. It's an SSA. It's an SAC. It's an SPA, and it's got that way because of you and your predecessors and the people who were there. Somebody turns up and says, "This is very nice. I want to designate it." You go, "That's good. Designate it." And then they come back and say, "Right, stop doing it." Stop doing what? Everything. stop burning it rotationally, stop this, stop that, stop the other, and then they go away. And you think, what the bloody hell happened then? And that repeats itself across the piece. All that anybody is asking is that the rural community as a whole, but certainly the people that own and work the land, should be treated with the respect that they deserve. That's all you ask. And listened to, for God's sake. One of the points of this book is I have tried to put other people's voices in it. Each chapter starts with a quote. Well, one doesn't. But nearly all of them start with a quote from somebody else. I've had to keep their names out of it because the atmosphere is now so toxic, thanks to the social media and some of the people like Packham and Co, that people won't have their names put in things because they're going to get trolled, but at least their voices are there. And that is essential, that the regulators and the conservation industry at least have the decency to listen.
You will be able to buy Ian's book afterwards. You'll be delighted to hear over in the corner, but I'm going to give him 5 minutes at the end to do that, and he will sign it for you, I suspect, as well. Ian, so you have been chairman of the GWCT, Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. Supposing there was an enormous outbreak of common sense and they made you chairman of the RSPB as well, what would you do?
Bring up some friends, I think, and explain. Well, what you do is what you do when you take over any large organisation. You first of all look at the frontline staff you've got and check that everybody's doing what you want them to do, and if you take an issue, and this is a key issue, I think, is that we know about the Lawrence thing with the Met. The Met were found to be institutionally racist. They were unaware of that. I think they were entirely unaware of it, but that's what they found. I think the RSPB and the regulators are institutionally prejudiced against the people that own and work the land. That's what I think. And if I ran National England, for instance, the first thing I would do first thing in the morning, well, the first thing I'd do is get my file out to see what they've been saying about me for the last 20 years. The second thing I'd do is I'd say, right, I want an analysis of all the licence and consent applications, and I want them in that pile over there for the conservation industry that have been granted, and I want to know how long it took, and I want them in a pile over here for landowners, farmers and gamekeepers, and how many of them were granted and how long they took. And I'll tell you now, there would be an enormous difference. This pile would be big, with a turnaround time of a couple of weeks. This pile would be tiny, with a turnaround time of 6 to 12 months. It is an institutional system now, and it has to change, otherwise it won't work.
All institutional systems like that will fall apart if they carry on down the street. I'm going to go slightly to the right of you, I think, on this one, and throw a question about would it help the RSPB if they managed to get rid of gamekeepers by monstering them in the media? Would it help if there was no competition for the management of Britain's, well, your subject is moorlands, but let's say Britain's countryside?
Yeah, I think, well, it's an interesting question. It wouldn't help wildlife, that's a certain fact. It wouldn't help conservation and biodiversity. It might help them because, well, there is a misconception in the shooting community in particular, but in the countryside in general, I think, and certainly if you're a great shooting estate, nobody will come and look at you because they don't want to be disabused of their prejudices. But if you are, you've got enormous biodiversity, you've got more curlews on your estate, which is not uncommon for a grouse moor, than the RSPB have got on all of their land, then you think that they will say, well done, good and faithful servant, you should be celebrated. No, their teeth grind. You can hear them grinding from 20 feet away. Because the last thing they want is some private sector oik to go and demonstrate that they're a bloody sight better at doing what they're paid to do. And that's the truth. No, they just don't want to know. So when I tell them, and I have told them, I have to say, that Ruaben's a bloody sight better than Lake Vyrnwy, they don't go, oh, that's wonderful, we must celebrate Ruaben. They look for a corridor to take it down and strangle it. So it's not It's not as one would expect.
How about what's recently become out in Wales over the last couple of weeks, this idea that shooting is, whether or not it is good for the environment, good for wildlife, it is a demerit activity. We should not encourage it as a Welsh government. I mean, in that context, isn't it, wouldn't the RSPB argue they are on the side of the angels?
Well, they're on the side of the fallen angels, in my view. One of the most extraordinary things that has developed in my lifetime is that if I shoot and I'm a conservationist, I'm not asking anybody's bloody opinion about that, I'm telling you. And there are plenty of people in the conservation industry who would rather see something die out than work with people like me. That's not conservation, that's cast iron prejudice. So that's the first thing. So the second thing is you're then reinventing history. So Peter Scott is now virtually a vegan, and every time you read about him, he actually hated wildfowling, but he went along because his friends did it and all this. It's nonsense. He was ready in tooth and claw. I'm a wildfowler. He frightened me, the stuff he shot. So there's a reinvention of stuff, and in the end, is there a moral distinction? Yes, there is. There's a moral distinction. I shoot my own dinner. What I always ask people when they attack me is, I shoot my own dinner. Who kills yours? And they go, you go, well, if you don't know, how do you know it's done properly? How do you know it ever took place? Killing things, and I'm sorry if this frightens anybody, I don't think you will in this audience, killing things is natural. But one of the odd things about animal rights is it is based on the premise that we're all animals, and so we should treat them the way they treat other animals. Well, I do, but I'm up the predator end of the market rather than the herbivore. And I would also point out that it's probably only possible that we're here using microphones in a tent because we are descended from carnivores. Can anybody tell me the most clever herbivore that I've met? I knew a good horse.
Well, Chris Packham's quite clever, isn't he?
I knew a clever horse once, I have to say. But they're not the brightest, sharpest tools. You look at the clever stuff: dolphins, predator; killer whale, predator; wolf, predator; human being, predator. We are predators. The idea that we should somehow absent ourselves from the consequences of 250,000 years of evolution because somebody that lives in a town doesn't like the idea of me killing something, well, get over it, boys, because it's, this is madness. If you go to the extreme, so you've got to give RSPB their credit. There's an island in the Tristan da Cunha group in the South Atlantic, which has a Tristan da Cunha albatross on it. And the Tristan da Cunha albatross grew up without any predators of any sort. So when it's on its nest, its chicks on its nest, it has evolved no escape mechanism whatsoever. It just sits there. Somebody wrecked a ship, and house mice swam ashore many, many years ago. They're grown to be big mice, but they're still mice. Now, even a big mouse isn't like a jaguar or a leopard. What the mice do is that they've discovered that during the nesting season there's a ready source of food in the form of the chicks of the Tristan da Cunha albatross. So they eat them. But they don't kill them and eat them, they eat them. Now, I don't know if you can think of a worse way to die, but being eaten alive by a mouse has got to go into the upper end of this. So RSPB, to their credit, are airlifting poison to kill the mice. Brilliant. But a lot of compassionate conservationists, as they call themselves, are completely opposed to this. Well, I'll tell you what. If you think that it's a good idea that baby albatrosses are eaten alive by big mice, do not use the word conservationist to describe yourself, and do not use the word compassionate, because neither of them apply. Not in my dictionary.
Ian Coghill, thank you very much.